Well, hey, Foilers, thank you so much for tuning in to this first ever REFOILED episode. So it's been an amazing first year and a half on the foil, and as we approach episode 75, we are able to get into the vault, if you will, and bring out some of our older episodes to share with folks that may be just tuning into the show, or maybe you've been listening to the show for a while and you haven't had an opportunity to listen to some of these gems that we have in the vault from almost a year ago now. And we're going to start it off with this episode right here, episode 37, The Gates of Hell with Derek Gilbert. Derek was really our first major guest on the show that we had that really operates in our space. It was so gracious of him to come on to a show with two knuckleheads that had just started off, podcasting, and we really hadn't done a whole lot yet. And so he really kind of opened the door for us to start to get other guests on the show. So we'll always be eternally grateful to Derek. It was really awesome of him to come on the show. But the conversation that we had with Derek is fantastic because it's an episode that I recommend to everybody that first joins the show or listens to the show or signs up to be a member. It's the first episode I always recommend that they listen to. And he was gracious enough not only to come on the show, but then also talk to us about a book that he actually hadn't even finished publishing yet. So it's an amazing discussion, an amazing topic, and it really revolves around Christ operating in Caesarea Philippi and the whole history behind what exactly Caesarea Philippi means and what exactly that whole area is and why it was always known as the Gates of Hell, why you see the exchange between Christ and the disciples and everything that happens up there. And it's really kind of an interesting thing because once you understand the whole depth of what's happening in Genesis 6, you understand much more detail what is happening in Caesarea Philippi when Christ is having this discussion with his disciples. So it's an absolute masterclass by Derek. He's done a ton of study. He's visited these areas. He and his wife Sharon and several other people together. So Derek is a great resource for this. So hope you guys enjoy this. Dive into the vault for episode 37, The Gates of Hell with Derek Gilbert, REFOILED. Enjoy.
It was like the Canaanite hell opened in ancient Bashan, the kingdom of Og. So Jesus took his disciples there to this cult, this pagan cult site at the base of Mount Hermon, which I think the best way for people to think about it, this is like the Canaanite version of Mount Olympus. It's where the gods met. And Jesus goes there and says, "Who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, who do you say that I am?" And when Peter says, "Well, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," Jesus confirms it. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for this was not confirmed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." Yeah. Then he gets into some wordplay. I say, "You are Petros, Peter, and on this Petra, this rock, this 9,200-foot mountain behind me, that is the Canaanite Mount Olympus, I will build my ecclesia, my congregation. And the gates of hell," which is this really big cave right over here, "will not prevail against it."
Well, hello and welcome to the Tinfoil Hat Club podcast. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Ben.
And thank you for joining us yet again. So we have a very special guest today. We're super excited to have him on, and we just thank him very much for giving us his time. It is a gentleman by the name of Derek Gilbert. Now, some of you may be familiar with that name, and some of you may not, but we are super excited to talk to Derek today. Give you a little bit of a quick outline of kind of the things that Derek is into. He is a busy man. He actually hosts a daily news analysis program, 5 and 10, for Skywatch TV. And then Sci Friday is another thing that you co-host. An Unraveling Revelation with his wife, who's also an author, and analyst Sharon Gilbert. And then since 2014, I know you guys have both produced a weekly weekly audio series of Bible studies, the Gilbert House Fellowship. And that's available at gilberthouse.org. And you've got a trip coming up that you're going to go over to Israel. That is going to be fantastic. And I know that you've got another trip planned, I think in 25, from March 25th to April 3rd, with you and your wife, and then you're going to have some special guests on that trip as well. Dr. Judd Burden, hopefully he's well by then. I know he's not feeling well. And Doug Van Dorn and Timothy Alberino. So you are a busy man.
Supposed to join us. Tim was supposed to join us this year, but because of things that have been going on, we've delayed the tour. We delayed it to fall. Then we thought, okay, fall, we've got the election coming up, and who knows what's going to happen around that time. There may be a little more, fiery but mostly peaceful protests going on, to borrow a phrase from the corporate media. So we decided to just roll it into next year. So Doug Van Dorn and Judd Burton, two of my co-hosts on a monthly roundtable series that we have on my podcast, A View from the Bunker, we call Iron and Myth. We wanted Brian Godawa to come with us, and Brian was like, okay, and then, nah, I just don't like to travel, so no, I'm not going to. Brian went with us to Israel back in 2018 when we had Dr. Michael Heiser with us. But yeah, for some reason, Brian is kind of like us. Basically, we would live inside, Sharon and me, we would live inside our heads all the time if we could, but you can't really reach anybody and influence anybody if you're just spending all your time, like up here and then on the written word. So, and because we are firm believers now, having been to Israel 3 times, that seeing the land and seeing these spiritual battleground sites really helps change the way you view the Bible. So for people to join us and for us to be able to share that excitement that we have. Okay, here's why we are today standing at the base of Mount Hermon in front of this giant cave called the Grotto of Pan, and then explain why we're there, why we take them locations that are not on the normal tours, like Joshua's Altar, where you literally have to get a bulletproof bus to go up there because it overlooks Nablus, which is a city that is, it's been home to a refugee camp called Balata since 1948. And how you can still be a refugee after 75 years, I don't know, but okay, that's for another day, I suppose. But going there is well worth it when you see it and you begin to understand why. God told the Israelites to come here immediately after they got into Canaan. So as soon as they conquered Jericho, go to this place, build this altar, get half the tribes on this mountain, the other half on that mountain, and then utter the following. Why there? Turns out there's some real history in that region. In fact, that's in the forthcoming book as well. We get into that. The city of Shechem, which is today called Nablus, a very interesting, supernaturally charged location like everywhere else that we go in Israel, including Jerusalem. So this upcoming trip, which will be shorter because there are areas you just can't get to now, like the Grotto of Pan, because it's so close to Lebanon. It's been evacuated. But we will go to Tel Aviv, we'll go to Jerusalem, and some of the sites in the south that were attacked on October 7th, we will be visiting those. Very small group. We may only have 10 people with us this time, 10 brave souls, but from 3 continents making this trip. And so we'll bring back some video and show what we saw when we're there. We want to see what's going on there without the filter of the corporate media here in the West.
No, that'd be fantastic. Yeah. It's definitely a trip that I've always wanted to take. It's a bucket list place to go. I know it can be pricey pricey to get over there, but definitely a trip that if you can do it, I would highly recommend it, from that standpoint of just the biblical history alone, having never been there myself. But man, just to be able to touch and see and actually put geography and with history and combine everything together with what you've read in the Bible, I would think would make the Bible come alive at a much, much, much deeper level. There's something you touched upon a second ago that I want to kind of let everybody know is Derek has actually written several books. He's got 7 books out now, and we are so excited because one of the things that he actually just finished submitting his final corrections for is his 8th book, and that book is called The Gates of Hell, and it talks about something that we're going to get into today, I'm sure in much detail, that Ben and I obviously have a huge passion for, kind of spreading the word on and getting people to understand, especially fellow Christians, is that aspect of just what the gates of hell are, where it is, and what that means. So definitely tell us a little bit about some of the things that you got going on in your book.
Well, first of all, I want to make clear this is another co-authored book by Sharon and me. So this will be the 3rd book that we have written together. The 2 previous being Veneration, which is sort of a deep dive into the cult of the Nephilim, the cult of Rephaim, the cult of the dead in ancient Israel. The second one, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, about the reality of these strange creatures that show up in Scripture. We figure if God is going to call them gods and giants and dragons, that maybe we as Christians ought to take those things seriously instead of just saying, well, these are just images and metaphors and symbols of whatever. that's not how God presented it to the prophets. So trying to view Scripture through the eyes of the prophets and the apostles is kind of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to invent some weird new way of reading the Bible. God does not need writers like Sharon and me. And I use the term writer about myself guardedly because, I mean, there are some people. Sharon is a writer. She when she writes, it flows and it's beautiful. Me, okay, I can write, but it's sort of like utilitarian. There's not much artistry there. I can convey ideas, but for me, it's more like the way I used to be on the high school debate team. Okay, here are my list of bullet point arguments, and I'm going to persuade you through the force of logic to accept my point of view. Hopefully, it's easy enough technical to read and digest. I guess so. And maybe that's a male-female thing. I don't know, but anyway, to call myself a writer, even with 8 published books, I hesitate. But anyway, the point of the book is that Jesus declared his divinity really for the first time at a specific geographic location called Caesarea Philippi. Now, this location in the ancient world was very important as a cult site of a number of pagan cults. In the time of Jesus and the apostles in the first century, there was a cult of the emperor there, so there was a temple for the venerated Roman emperor Caesar Augustus and his venerated deceased uncle Julius. There was a temple of Jupiter there. There was a temple of Pan. Dr. Judd Burton, who you mentioned, who fully intends to be there. In fact, he plans to be at a conference we're speaking at in July. He's one of the featured speakers at a conference in Dayton, Ohio, in the end of July. So we fully expect to see Judd making his way around Israel with us next March. He did his doctoral dissertation on the religious history of Banyas, what it's called today. In the days of the apostles, it was Paneas, for the goat demon Pan, the Greek. You typically portrayed as a playful little half human, half goat, played the pan pipes and stuff. But it is interesting that the only type of demon, we're going to keep this a G-rated program. The only type of demon that was even mentioned in the Old Testament are the Seirim, or goat demons. Back in the day when you had to walk 30 miles, that was like a 2 or 3 day hike. And in Israel, like here in the Ozarks, it was not necessarily flat terrain. You had a lot of mountains. And between the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus' ministry was based at Capernaum, and Caesarea Philippi, there was a big marsh, the Hulot Marsh, which was drained by the Israelis back in the 1950s. So it was not an easy hike. And yet he took them there specifically to declare himself the Messiah. This is where he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Which is an interesting question most of us just sort of skip over, because until the time of Jesus, that was a term that was not in the parlance of Jewish religion. They did not have a character that they were aware of called the Son of Man. There's a reference in Daniel 7:1, like a son of man, but in the Old Testament vernacular, that meant one who looks like a human. Because the term Son of Man is in the book of Ezekiel a number of times, but it's like the angel saying, okay, look, human one, see this. Yeah. Anyway, so Jesus goes there, he's got this new term, and he's doing it at this specific location that took them 2 days to get to. Why did he do it there? When you start digging into the history of the region, you understand why. In the first century, the Jewish historian Josephus wrote about that cave and said no one had ever been able to lower a plumb line long enough to reach the bottom. They believed it was a bottomless cave that literally opened into the underworld, the netherworld. And this was part of the ancient region of Bashan, which, according to the Canaanites, was literally the entrance to hell. I mean, it was like the Canaanite hell opened in ancient Bashan, the kingdom of Og. So Jesus took his disciples there to this pagan cult site at the base of Mount Hermon, which I think the best way for people to think about it, this is like the Canaanite version of Mount Olympus. It's where the gods met. And Jesus goes there and says, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now, who do you say that I am? And when Peter says, well, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, Jesus confirms it. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for this was not confirmed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And then he gets into some wordplay. I say, you are Petros, Peter, And on this Petra, this rock, this 9,200-foot mountain behind me, that is the Canaanite Mount Olympus, I will build my ecclesia, my congregation. Yeah. And the gates of hell, which is this really big cave right over here, will not prevail against it. And when you do that in front of, I've done this 3 times now in front of groups of people, and you hear 100 people all at once go, ah! When they realize the base of Mount Hermon, the entrance to the netherworld, and this is where Jesus declares his divinity. And then according to the Gospel of Matthew, 6 days later, he takes Peter, James, and John up the mountain for the transfiguration, which is like sending a flare into the spirit realm. Yeah. Why did he do it there? So we talk about that, and then we build on that from there. The gates of hell. I mean, since time immemorial, since prehistory, we can document this with megalithic sites like Göbekli Tepe or Stonehenge, or right there on the Golan Heights, you've got Gilgal Rephaim, which is way older, about 1,200 years older, according to the most recent archaeology, built around 3,700 BC. Gilgal Rephaim, 3,700 BC compared to Stonehenge around 2,500 BC. Stonehenge, they estimate the weight of those rocks, as impressive as they are, at about 2,000 tons. Compare that to the estimate for the rocks at Gilgal Rephaim, estimated anywhere between 42 and 60,000 tons of rocks.
Wow.
Now, nearly 6,000, and what's really interesting is that back in 2012, they found the remains of an older wall that had been dismantled on the site and the rocks repurposed for building Gilgal Rephaim. So that's a sacred site more than 6,000 years old, within sight of Mount Hermon, in the middle of the ancient kingdom called Bashan. Now, what were they doing with it? According to the archaeologist, Dr. Mike Freakman, who we spent a day with last March on site, there and at the megalithic site nearby called, they call it officially the El Arba'in Ridge, which is named for the Arabic village that was there until 1948. But we call it the Serpent Mound of Bashan because it looks like a 3/4 of a mile long serpent, 20 to 25 feet high, 200 feet wide, and covered with more than 140 megalithic tombs. Within 1/4 of a mile of Gilgal Rephaim. I mean, you can walk. It takes you 5 minutes to walk from one site to the other. What were they doing there? Why is this site so significant, at least for the last 6,000 years? And by the way, Bashan in the Ugaritic tongue, or in Hebrew, would mean literally place of the serpent. So here you got this massive serpent-shaped structure covered with funerary monuments, 6,000 years old, in a place named Place of the Serpent. And this thing is so big you can see it from Google Earth. You can literally see it from space. It makes the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio look like an inchworm. According to Dr. Freakman, Gilgal Rephaim in that central core was essentially an artificial underworld for a shaman or a priest to go inside, be surrounded in total darkness, and commune with the gods of the netherworld. So something about that region, because as Dr. Freakman has found in his archaeology and other Israeli archaeologists who've been combing the Golan Heights, ancient Bashan, since 1967 when they took it away from Syria, there are more than 5,500 dolmens and other megalithic monuments to the dead on the Golan Heights. In fact, the guy who led the survey of the Golan, a guy named Moshe Hartal, said in 2015, we can't use the term dolmen field anymore because for all intents, we don't know where one field ends and the next one begins on the Golan Heights. For all intents and purposes, the Golan Heights is one giant dolmen field. In other words, Kingdom of Og, which the Canaanites knew was the entrance to the netherworld, is essentially a giant necropolis. And we can take this all the way back to about 6,000 BC, the middle of the Copper Age, the Chalcolithic period. And according to Mike Freakman, the archaeologist, this is not only documented in these smaller dolmens covered with, a lot of dolmens covered with tumuli, which is like a big pile of rocks, like a cairn like you'd find in Scotland. But on the inside, you've got a dolmen. But they're constructed like smaller versions of Gilgal Rephaim, concentric rings of stone around a central core, just 20 feet across instead of 500 feet across. But what most people don't know, and which we learned just over the last couple of years in reading Mike Freakman's work on this, is that there are 3 other sites on the Golan Heights that look just like Gilgal Rephaim. We visited one, which is the most interesting because it's overlooking the Jordan River about 2 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, and it's within half a mile of Bethsaida, which was the hometown of the apostles Andrew, Peter, and Philip. There's no way they didn't know this thing was there.
Right.
So you got two others now. One is in the middle of a training area for the IDF, so you have to get special permission because, they might be practicing out there while you're looking at the rocks. And another one's in the middle of a minefield, so nobody can get to that one. But there are four of these
tread
giant...
lightly.
Exactly, yes. So there are 4 of these sites like Gilgal Rephaim on the Golan Heights. And amazingly, Gilgal Rephaim, as big as it is, and it also is visible from, the satellites like Google Earth and Apple Maps and so forth. Nobody knew it was there, apparently, until 1967 when the Israelis took it away from Syria, which is astonishing. This thing is 500 feet across. How could they miss it? So anyway, that's sort of the building point, the historical foundation of the book, The Gates of Hell. We look at that region and why was there such a cult of the dead anchored in that region, known not just from the Bible, but from the Ugaritic texts, which Ugarit was an Amorite kingdom based on the Mediterranean coast of Syria, close to where the border with Turkey is today. So even 200 miles away, they knew there was something about that region and about the Sea of Galilee connected to the gods of the underworld, the Rephaim. And it is clear when you start putting those pieces together, the apostles and the prophets knew about it too. And so did Jesus.
Absolutely. One of the things that you kind of had said there at the end, and there was something else that you kind of said earlier, I'll back up a little bit after I say this, but one of the things you said at the end there is, I think, so when you dig into, you have this event that occurs obviously before the flood that we're going to get into in a second, but then you have the Nephilim that appear after the flood. And it sure seems like to me, one of the ways that you can kind of track back, all of the root of it seems to always flow back into the Amorites. The Amorites, specifically the Amalekites, both of those groups, everything seems to emanate kind of back to that and then up from there somehow. But the other thing that you had mentioned was, it's just amazing to me, and I wanted to kind of get your take on this, because this is one of the things that I know that we talk about all the time, is in, modern day Christianity, especially in Western Christianity, because we don't know the geography, we don't know the history, we don't know some of these things. And when we only read the Bible, which is more than sufficient for salvation, but it just does not get you into the story that is occurring in Genesis 6. And so many things that we talk about on the show, that was the first show that we ever did. And it's amazing to me because the vast majority of things that we talk about on the show always come back to spiritual warfare. And when you talk spiritual warfare, you always come back to Genesis 6, because that is the essence of the beginning almost in a lot of ways, other than the fall, but heavy spiritual decay of what happened during that event in Genesis 6. And I think so few in the church now understand the connections between what Christ is doing in Caesarea Philippi right before he goes to Jerusalem, to be crucified, and then what he's actually doing during the transfiguration. And I even find it funny how a lot of modern scholars try to say that the transfiguration didn't even happen there, but they happened down at a mountain. Like, how far
Mount
away?
Tabor.
I forget the name of the other. Yeah, Mount Tabor, right? And that's like however many days walk away. Why would they go to the worst place known to man, stay for just a couple hours or maybe a day, and then scoot on down the road to try to get to this other mountain that isn't even a mountain? I don't think it qualifies. It's not even high enough. There's no doubt about it that the transfiguration occurred on Mount Hermon. And the reason it happened on Mount Hermon is because that is Christ egging on Satan to kill him. It's spiritual warfare 101.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. That there is a something that's lost when we strip out the supernatural aspects of this war. I mean, you take out Genesis chapter 6, you take out a lot of what is going on in the Old and New Testament.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of amazing to me. It's like, that's kind of been, it seems like part of the deliberate anesthetization of the church nowadays is to take that out of there so that we don't understand the real, spiritual warfare battles that are going on. And it's funny because we've had a lot of conversations, at our church, and Ben and I have had a lot of conversations about how thinly veiled evil and spiritual warfare is right now, if even veiled at all. It's right there in our face, and so many of our brothers and sisters in Christ just don't see it. It just goes flying right by their face. And I think it comes back to somewhere along the lines, we've got into this thinking of, we can't talk about these things, these spiritual war battles. It's somehow talking about anything from the spiritual aspect of things in that other realm became taboo almost. And why do you think that is?
Well, there are probably a number of causes. I think spiritually, there's been encouragement from the principalities and powers behind the scenes to desupernaturalize the Bible, because if you take out the existence of the enemy, then the need for salvation becomes a little more, it's not quite as urgent. The sense of urgency is lost. You can say you're engaging in spiritual warfare, but it comes down to, waging war against the demon of gluttony to have that, not have that second bowl of ice cream. Instead of thinking that there are literal spirit beings, evil intelligences that want to destroy you, your family, and everyone and everything that you love. And this was the worldview of the Jews until at least the 2nd century AD. This was certainly the understanding of the prophets and the apostles. The early church understood it as well. When you read the writings of the early church fathers, it's clear that they understood that demons were real and that their origin was in the spirits of the giants who died in the flood of Noah, and that there were fallen angels, that they're pagan neighbors who believed in Zeus and Apollo and Juno and Athena, et cetera, that those were real entities, but they were fallen angels. And so, in fact, the worst persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire was not under Nero, it was under Diocletian toward the end of the 3rd century. And it was because the oracles of Apollo were falling silent, and they blamed it on the righteous men, meaning Christians. These Christians are blocking the signal. We can't get you the oracle that you need to tell you if you should go to war with Parthia or whatever. And so Diocletian ordered the persecution of Christians, stripping property, kicking them out of the army, throwing them in jail, what have you. And that ended just before Constantine came to power in the early 4th century and then legalized the faith. But it is a historic fact that these oracles, who had been more than happy to cough up, now, okay, were they doing a political thing and saying, gee, Emperor, we'd like to help you, but we can't, because as a way of getting the emperor to crack down on Christianity and try to remove the competition? Maybe. But there's some evidence, and we go into that in our book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, that the oracles were communicating with something, and these things with which they were communicating admitted that they were not the one true God. They were lesser gods, if you will. When we understand that we're on a battlefield and that the enemy is real, I think we take the faith much more seriously. Not that we should look for a demon behind every corner, but understand that there is a bigger game that's taking place outside of the limits of human sight. The things that are happening in the world today that seem to make no sense suddenly become a lot clearer and easier to understand if you take Paul literally. In the book of Ephesians, the letter to the church at Ephesus, when he writes, we're not wrestling against human opponents, against principalities and powers and cosmic rulers over the present darkness. He didn't mean politicians. He meant literal fallen angels and their demonic minions who want to destroy what God created and called good. I think one of the parables Jesus taught it really illustrates what's going on. And that's the parable of the wicked tenants. And I only came to this understanding within the last year or so. So it's not like this is something that, years ago I'm still learning. I'm coming late to the party here. The parable of the wicked tenants is the one where better late than never. And thank you, Lord, for
amen,
being
brother.
patient.
Amen.
The parable of the wicked tenants, you've got a landowner in a far-off land who buys a piece of property and he walls it around, puts guard towers up, plants a vineyard, and then he hires out these tenants. Lets these tenant farmers basically lease it, and their payment is to produce, grapes and then send the produce to this landowner far away. And they don't do it. He sends someone to collect. They beat him up and send him away. He sends another one. They beat him up and send him away. And so the landowner says, well, I'll send my son. Surely they will respect him. And when he arrives, the tenants say, if we kill him, we will get his inheritance. And so then Jesus asks the scribes and the Pharisees who are there testing him, what's going to happen to those tenants? Well, when the landowner comes, they will be destroyed. And then they perceived that Jesus was talking about them. I don't think I think in a sense he was talking about them because they were the spiritual shepherds of Israel who'd been misleading people and not producing the fruit that they were supposed to produce. But more than that, he was talking to the principalities and powers behind them. And again, this is the understanding of the early church fathers. When you read the early church theologians, they understood that angelic beings had been delegated responsibility for administering this creation called earth and humanity as well. And they were mismanaging because they wanted it for themselves. And so God sent his son. They thought, if we kill him, we'll get his inheritance. Well, sorry, Jesus was resurrected. He came back from the dead. And as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2, if the archons, if the rulers of the age had understood, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They fulfilled his mission for him. So this is what's going on here. This is a long game where God the Father delegated responsibility to lesser Elohim, fallen angels, if you will, weren't fallen at the time, but surely knowing the end from the beginning, God saw that they were going to be drawn away. It was a test and a trap, as Sharon puts it in her Red Wing Saga series of novels, a test and a trap. God knew that they would fall, but he created us and the angelic realm with free will. And many of them, like all of us, have chosen badly. So they are doomed, according to Psalm 82, which is like a courtroom scene in heaven. God has decreed death on these angels. Though you are gods, all of you sons of the Most High, like men you shall die. Well, that's what's going on here. We are fighting a holding action as humans. Okay, the gates of hell will not prevail against God's ecclesia, his church, Christ's church. We are to hold our ground. It's interesting in Ephesians 6, going back to that, when you read all the way down to verse 20, beginning of verse 12, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Paul uses the word stand and withstand 4 times. He doesn't say charge. We're not charging the gates of hell. We are standing against the darkness. We are holding our ground. We're like the men of the West in The Lord of the Rings in front of the gates of Mordor. We are standing and holding our ground until the cavalry led by Christ himself comes back, and he will win the victory.
Amen.
I will say this. I am glad that you're like saying so many things that I've been saying the past few years, so I'm not crazy. It's nice to know that somebody's right there with me as well.
Well, I guess worst case scenario, gentlemen, worst case scenario, there are 3 of us.
That's right.
Well, and my wife's right here with us too, so at least 4.
Amen.
And we got a few other friends,
Amen,
so we got a small
4.
band here. Call it the Fellowship of the King. I'll credit Sharon and Seth too, the Fellowship of the King.
Yes. I've got a question for you. A few years ago, I was talking to my wife about all this pansexual stuff. And this is my little theory that I think it could be a spirit of Pan. What do you think about that?
Well, it could be, but there was an older entity that was worshipped in Sumer as far back as, well, the beginning of written records. Some of the oldest writing that we know of from Sumer is in praise of a goddess called Inanna. She was later called Ishtar by the Akkadians and the Babylonians. In the Bible, she's Astarte or Ashtoreth, which is just a Hebrew pejorative based on the name Astarte. Aphrodite, Venus, there were Atargatis, there were a number of names for her, Shauska in the Hurrian and Hittite pantheon. She was gender fluid 5,000 years ago. I mean, there are Sumerian
Okay.
hymns that have been preserved to this day that praise her for being able to change men into women and women into men. She herself is sometimes depicted with male attributes like a beard. In the Hurrian pantheon, her Hurrian equivalent Shauska, there's a very famous series of carvings at a site in Turkey. The stone walls on either side of this little enclosure or box canyon or something, where you've got the male deities on one wall, and on the opposite wall you've got the female deities, and Shauska is on both. So this is who you're dealing with. In the Canaanite pantheon, in fact, at Ugarit, Astarte, the goddess of love, actually the goddess of carnality, she had essentially split into two aspects by that point. In the ancient world, she was represented by the planet Venus, and of course that's a Roman name, Venus. In the Canaanite pantheon, to the Amorites, she was Astarte in evening, the goddess of sex, but in the morning she was Athtar, the war god. And that really reflected the two aspects of her personality in ancient Mesopotamia: goddess of sex and just mindless violence.
That makes sense of what's going on today.
Well, it does. She really is the spirit of the age. We argued on our program, Unraveling Revelation, that Inanna, or Ishtar, is the spirit of the age, because between gender fluidity and just violence, if you won't let me have my way, we'll just have a fiery but mostly peaceful protest. Yeah. And
Yeah, right.
we're living in an age where criticism, of someone else is violence. You're harming me with your words, but they can punch you if they say, "Well, you're a fascist, so I can punch you." That's legit. So actual violence is just legitimate protest, but speaking words and contradicting or countering someone else's worldview, that's violence. It's like, this makes no sense unless you look at it from a spiritual perspective, and then it makes all the sense in the world. They have turned humanity now. We're living in an age where, contrary to what I was hearing when I was growing up, in fact, when I was in high school back in the 70s and on the high school debate team, one of the recurring themes when we were preparing our arguments, we would have a proposal like resolve that the United States should significantly change its foreign trade policies. And then we would argue the pros and cons of that or whatever. And the idea that we would overrun the carrying capacity of the earth was an argument that negative teams would always bring up. What's the disadvantage to this plan? Raising the living standards of those poor people in Africa will cause them to be too fertile and will overrun the carrying capacity. The Malthusian nightmare, a reference to the 18th century clergyman Thomas Malthus, who argued that we were going to overpopulate the world and we would all starve to death. Well, demographers just within the last few years are now reaching the consensus that, contrary to what we're being told by the the Gaia cult, we are not overrunning the carrying capacity of the earth, first of all. Secondly, almost every nation in the northern hemisphere is not having children at replacement level.
Yeah.
We are beginning to reach peak humanity. By about 2050 or 2060, the population of the world will begin to decline. By the year 2100, it will be in decline. And if I remember correctly, there are only 4 of the 208 nations listed in this most recent study, only 4 or 5 out of 208 that will still have a growing population. And these are small places like Chad and Tobago, and but the major nations like all of Europe, all of North Africa, East Asia, China, Japan, the Koreas, Singapore, Hong Kong, most of Africa, everywhere, population is falling, and we are doing this to ourselves. Now, why would we do this? We've been convinced that children are a burden, children are a hassle, children are economically unaffordable. And look at the state the world is in. How can we? And besides, carbon footprint. We have children, they're emitting carbon, and we can't. So we are literally on the verge of what they're calling a demographic collapse. Now, will that happen? Don't know. I mean, there's still time to turn it around. But when you get to a certain age, I'm the tail end of the baby boom, and I'm 62 years old. I'm not having any more children. And that's the bump in the population curve. We're getting into an age where you younger fellas are going to be expected to cough up the taxes to pay all the Medicare and Medicaid expenses for old people like me and Sharon. And in places like Japan, it is already becoming unsustainable. There are sad stories of little old ladies in Japan who are going out and committing crimes so they can get themselves incarcerated and be supported, even if it means having to be in jail, because they don't have any family members and they're lonely and they're hungry. You know, it's tragic, but this is a story that is going to be repeated over and over around the world. I mean, we are an aging, shrinking population. How did we get here? I suggest that this was spiritual and that entities like this Inanna coming back to her, because even though she was the goddess of carnality, she was never depicted as a mother goddess. Sex, yeah, but children, no. And that's the world we live in today.
Yeah, no, it's definitely the case. I saw a good interview. I think it was on Joe Rogan. Actually, it was a guy that worked for, I believe, the State Department. He was an analyst for the State Department, I think. And he said that China is actually kind of the tip of the spear for the population decline right now because of all the decisions that they made, you know, however many years ago to limit the amount of children per home. So now they have a huge imbalance in their workforce. They have a huge imbalance in their gender disbursement. And they're getting ready to have a massive population cliff dive here over the next couple decades because of the decisions that they've made.
I mean, it's astonishing. And again, this is counterintuitive because we've been so indoctrinated over the last 50, 60 years, really since the book by Paul Ehrlich, The Population Bomb, which came out in the late 60s, if I remember right. You know, again, in high school, even on the debate team, it was like I would hear it every weekend at a tournament. Malthusian nightmare. You feed these people, they're going to have too many babies, they're going to overrun the carrying capacity, therefore we're all going to die. It's like, so my response was, okay, so you get to play God and decide who gets to live and who dies, so that the Africans should starve so that you and your kids and anyway. But was the mindset. We're overrunning the carrying capacity of the world. Not true, first of all. Secondly, the Chinese, you're right, that is the tip of the spear. Right now they've got about 1.4 billion Chinese, but their own statistics now, I just read this a couple of weeks ago, University in Shanghai produced a study where they showed that they expect their population to drop to about 600 million, possibly as low as 500 million by the end of this century. That is greater than...
And that's what they've admitted
more
to.
than half their people, that's what they've admitted to. Yeah. And again, China's not alone. I mean, the Russian government for years now has been trying to encourage people to go have babies. The government of Hungary now offering tax breaks, have 2, 3 kids. China's now got a 3-child policy instead of the 1-child policy that we heard about. They dropped the 1-child policy years ago, went to 2. Now they're trying to get 3. But people are like, well, why should we do that? The kids are messy. They cost money. It's like, hey, we're enjoying our new middle class lifestyle. Don't want kids to cramp my style.
Exactly. Yeah.
Just like us in the West. So we're not having children at replacement rates. I think in part, I used to think this was simply a political ploy. Our open borders here in the United States. We've added 10 million illegals to the country in the last 3 years. We're now at a point where you've got more people crossing the border illegally than babies being born in the United States on a month by month basis. There are more illegals crossing the southern border than there are babies being born here in the United States. Why are we doing that? I used to think, okay, it's political. Maybe they can't vote, at least not in federal elections yet. But when the census is taken, they still get counted. And representation in the House of Representatives is determined by population. So people are fleeing California, people who lived there for decades, but you're flooding and replacing them with migrants so that California will still get its same representation in the House of Representatives. But now I think, more than that, I think it's economic. I mean, if you're trying to grow the economy, hey, GDP is up 3-4% this year, that's great. How can you do that if your population is dropping?
Yeah, you can't.
You can't. Yeah. So you bring in more people. And I think that's what's happening.
Of
course, the side effect of that,
I had
though,
5
is...
kids.
Well, God bless you, brother.
Ben's
I only had
for all
one,
of us.
so you...
God bless you. It's definitely the case. I think the other thing, too, it's so funny because it seems like there's kind of 2 discussions that we've had today, but it's really not. It's one discussion. Because what we do is, and I see so many of our brothers and sisters in Christ, they get caught up in the window, what I call the window dressing. It's all of these things that we see that seem political or seem nefarious, but it's often referred to like this, this entity, this cabal, if you will, this mystical, magical group that nobody can quite nail down who it is. And it's like, no, that's just the surface stuff. And we need to address that stuff. I'm not trying to say that we need to be blind to it, but what's going on is really the important stuff is what's just underneath the surface of that. And it comes back to this spiritual warfare again. It's always comes back to the spiritual warfare, because if we can destroy humanity, if we can drag everybody down, make everyone poor, make everyone suicidal, drug them out of their minds, have them kill their children, all of the old gods. We've been joking about this the last few weeks. Joking's a bad word to say, but talking about this last few weeks between Ben and I, it's just like all these old gods are returning again. The worship of all these old gods is just coming right back. So it's just incredible how it ties into this discussion.
Stories that have come out in corporate media here, mainstream media, in the last couple of weeks about how in Rome and in Athens, you've got people who are now openly going and trying to reconstruct the rituals that were taking place until the rise of Christianity, in worshiping Jupiter and Juno and Apollo and Zeus and Athena and so on. The Olympic ceremony that just went this week to light the Olympic flame for the 2024 Olympics in Paris began with a prayer to Apollo and a prayer to Zeus. We argued in Giants, Gods, and Dragons that Apollo is the rider on the white horse, because the crown that he wears in Revelation 6 is a Stephanos in Greek, Stephanos, and that was the laurel wreath crown that was given to winners in the Olympic Games, and later became the symbol of the Roman emperors. Because according to the myth, Apollo chased a river nymph that he wanted to, love up, and she had her father, the river god, change her into a laurel tree. So to honor her always, Apollo created the laurel wreath, and that's the Stephanos. But when you get into the actual beast, the Antichrist, because there's some who think that, okay, he's a rider on the white horse going forth, conquering and to conquer. He's got a bow. That must be the Antichrist, because we know the rider on the white horse in Revelation 19 is Jesus, whereas he's got many diadems and so on. So clearly different. The difference between a diadem and a Stephanos, a diadem is a crown of royalty. And the Antichrist, who emerges from the sea in Revelation 13, has 10 diadems, whereas this rider on the white horse just has a Stephanos. We would argue, and by the way, the bow, in Greek, the word is toxon, and that's the only place in the New Testament that word is used, but it's the same root word from which we get toxic and toxicity, so it's like a poison arrow. Apollo was an archer. He was the plague god. He was known in Canaan as Resheph, and in Babylon as Nergal. In fact, Resheph was not just venerated among the Canaanites, he was also venerated by some of the Egyptians, including the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep II, who just happened to be the pharaoh of the Exodus, whom you might recall was persuaded to release the Hebrews by a series of plagues that the plague god, his personal protector deity, could not stop. Apollo, or Resheph, according to a text found at the ancient Syrian city of Ebla, an Amorite kingdom in northern Syria that dates back to 2500 BC. Well, it's known from texts found there that one of the cities sacred to Resheph, Apollo, was the city of Shechem, or modern-day Nablus. So, interestingly, you put these puzzle pieces together, you see, okay, 1,000 years before the Exodus, we know that this city was sacred to Resheph. 1406 BC, 1446, the Israelites flee Egypt, whose ruler was worshiping Resheph as his personal protector deity, who, by the way, was also the personal protector of chariots and chariot warriors. Then God, of course, drowns his chariots in the sea, in the Red Sea, and then sends Moses and Joshua, or tells them, because Moses didn't cross the Jordan River, tells them, when you cross into the land, go to Shechem to Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim and set up, the camps and then proclaim the blessings and the curses. So the king worshiping Resheph, then they go to the city sacred to Resheph and basically build an altar there and say, ha ha, you cannot make this stuff up. And it just points back to what we were discussing. I mean, the whole theme of this discussion, the gates of hell, where Jesus, if he had taken his followers to Caesarea Philippi, this cult center where Jupiter was worshipped and Pan was worshipped and Nemesis, there was also a temple to Nemesis there, and said, all of this stuff is fake. These gods don't exist. This mountain here where the Canaanites believe their creator god El lives with Asherah and their 70 sons, it's all a lie. It's all fake. But he didn't do that.
No, never
he didn't
happens.
do that. I mean, he took them there specifically. He moved his base of operations from Nazareth after the arrest of John the Baptist, according to Matthew, in Matthew chapter 4, and moved to Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, which is where the Jordan River enters the sea. It travels through a valley from Mount Hermon down to the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew writes in chapter 4, beginning at verse 12, when he heard that John had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and lived at Capernaum by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali, so that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah might be fulfilled. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan. I have to stop there to explain. The way of the sea is the Roman road, the Via Maris, which led from Alexandria, Egypt, up to Tiberias on the west shore of the Sea of Galilee, then up through the Jordan Valley to the site of ancient Hatzor, and then it cuts off to the northeast towards Damascus. Beyond the Jordan, at Hatzor, it would cross the Jordan River and go off towards Damascus. The way of the sea beyond the Jordan, that is the area of ancient Bashan. Okay, north of the Sea of Galilee, east of the Jordan River. We're talking now about ancient Bashan. And then Matthew calls it, and he's quoting from Isaiah chapter 9. Galilee of the Gentiles, the people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and shadow of death, on them a light has dawned.
Wow.
Shadow of death. 23rd Psalm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The Jordan River runs through a valley. There are mountains on both sides of that valley between Mount Hermon and the Sea of Galilee. And on both sides, you've got these dolmens, these megalithic funerary monuments devoted to the cult of the dead. And Jesus, according to Matthew, fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 9, which is the prophecy, by the way, that includes the famous lines, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given," a messianic prophecy.
Yeah.
He moved there and fulfilled the prophecy. Those dwelling in darkness in the region and the shadow of death, on them a light has dawned. So Jesus could have said, look, all of this was just symbolic. It's all metaphorical, okay? You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. I'm here. It's all cool. All these are just the imaginary friends of the Greeks and the Romans, and they don't really exist. He didn't do that. And we see over and over again in the scripture, Jesus casting out demons, and God, in fact, in Exodus chapter 12, when he's telling Moses, okay, on this night, you need to have everybody inside, put the lamb's blood on the lintel, because they're going to go through the land on that day and execute judgment on all the gods of Egypt. So what, is it going to break the idols? No, he was executing judgment on the gods worshipped by the Egyptians, the spirit beings. Now, where do we see that in Scripture? What happened to it? We don't know. It's not explicit, but there are certain hints here and there in the Psalms, especially Psalm 68, Psalm 82, Psalm 89, references to the heavenly beings, all you gods, though you are gods, all of you sons of the Most High. God calls them gods, and he seems to take them seriously, especially in Psalm 82. It's like, again, it's like a courtroom scene in heaven.
Yeah,
and so this war is real. And Jesus declared war on it right from the beginning of his ministry. In fact, we argue that we're working on a video that we hope to have out before the end of this year. We'd hope to have it out by now already, since it's more than a year since we shot the video. But we're going to call it The Valley of the Shadow of Death. because we think that that site overlooking the Jordan River, similar to Gilgal Rephaim, we think that's where Jesus was baptized, not down near Jericho.
I agree. Yeah, I think that I do not think the accepted site of where they have it is proper. It just doesn't. It's never set right with me. It's so funny because from the very part of our discussion, and I was pulling up the Bible verse while we were talking, but from the first time you mentioned the word Bashan, which is prevalent all over the Old Testament, especially. But one of the things that came to mind was actually Psalm 22. So you just referenced Psalm 23, but in Psalm 22 is also very prophetic because there's like 7 different prophetic prophecies in there that are actually fulfilled just while Christ is on the cross. But in Psalm 22, verse 13, it actually says, "Many bulls surround me, wild bulls of Bashan close in on me." So it's yet another reference. I'll keep going, actually. They open their mouths wide against me like ravening, roaring lions. And then the next line after that is, "I'm poured out like water," which is obviously what happened when he had the spear put in his side. So it's just yet another reference to this ancient spiritual warfare that goes back to the very, very beginning.
And what's really interesting about this, a scholar named Robert Miller II wrote a paper some years ago called, not that long ago, within the last 10 years, titled "The Baals of Bashan." And the point of his paper was showing that contrary to what most Bible commentators have spec'd for centuries, that the references to the bulls of Bashan here, the reference in Amos to the fat cows of Bashan, Ezekiel 39, "You will dine on the flesh of kings and of captains and of horses, all of them fat beasts of Bashan." Oh, Bashan was well known for its livestock. The bulls of Bashan, the cows of Bashan. Yes, livestock, the cattle of Bashan must have been world famous back in the day. And Dr. Miller went and showed, he actually combined climatology and agronomy to show that Bashan, then and now, was a terrible place for raising cattle. He actually showed that just based on the soil of Bashan, you cannot grow enough grass to have a profitable cattle operation. Yes, you can have flocks and herds of sheep and goats. They do fine. But cattle? No. This is a terrible place for raising cattle. Anyone trying to raise cattle there would go broke. His point was that when you see the bulls of Bashan, the cows of Bashan, the fat beasts of Bashan, they're referencing these entities connected to the cult of the dead, fallen angel spirits. In other words, the Baals of Bashan, not bulls. So I think we need to, again, supernaturalize the Bible, because the people reading this 3,000 years ago in the time of David would have understood exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you roll right from Psalm 22 into Psalm 23, the valley of the shadow of death, and even then Psalm 24, "Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors." Which gates is he talking about? Oh, perhaps the gates of hell. The gates of Sheol back in the day. We have to remember that when they wrote the Bible, they didn't have chapters and verses. That was added by Gutenberg when he put it out in the printing press. So we assume that when there's a chapter break, that's where, there's, okay, this is a new psalm, new chapter. Not necessarily.
Right. It's completely different magically.
One text. Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating because one of the things that I actually had that I wanted to get your take on was one of the interesting things that I see in the temptation when Christ is being tempted by Satan. He is taken up to a high mountain. It doesn't say where. It doesn't say where it is. I believe that, and I have nothing to back this up other than it just makes a lot of sense. I believe that he actually was taken up on Mount Hermon. It makes the most sense when he was tempted and said, "I can give you the whole world. Here it is. Just bow the knee," right?
Completely agree.
And, he basically says, "Get behind me, Satan." And it's so fascinating to me that it always seems so harsh when, Jesus is in this same area and Peter is now telling him, "Lord, you can't talk like this. You can't, say that you're going to be crucified." And his response to Peter is exactly the same as what he responded to Satan when he was being tempted. And it's basically, I'm wondering if in Christ's mind, it's like, you know what? We were here before, and you have the spirit in you right now of Satan, because he was tempting me before. And I told him, get behind me, get lost. And I'm going to tell you the same thing, because what you're asking or what you're wanting to happen is counter to my Father's will. And it's fascinating, because I think that those encounters occurred in the exact same place, which is right there at Caesarea Philippi and Mount Hermon.
Doug Van Dorn pointed something out as we were discussing this some time back. We were talking about portals as one of our topics on our monthly Iron and Myth Roundtable. And he pointed out that the Greek word translated wilderness, I'm looking at Matthew chapter 4, which is where we get the reference to the very high mountain. And just so people understand, Mount Hermon is 3 times higher than any other mountain in or near Israel. So when you're talking about a very high mountain, that is the only logical choice in the region. But beginning of Matthew chapter 4, Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. The word wilderness in Greek is eremon. And we don't have any scholarly backing on this, but the speculation is it possible that eremon is perhaps a loan word from Hebrew, Hermon, which derives from the Semitic word meaning under the ban, harem, eremon. Again, I've always thought wilderness, okay, this must be the wilderness of Judea.
Yeah, right.
So we're talking somewhere near the Dead Sea. But that region there in Bashan, according to archaeologists, was more or less depopulated at the end of the Bronze Age. It was not really heavily inhabited, even in the 1st century AD. So, and if you go there now, you can see why. I mean, it's basically, well, it's, in some ways, it's kind of like where we live in southwest Missouri. It's like a thin layer of soil on top of a bunch of rock. It's just here it's limestone, and over there it's basalt. It's volcanic, because there are extinct volcanoes in that very close by. So when the Greeks were looking for a word for wilderness, did they take it from that region? It's possible. Mm-hmm. We tend to view the history of the people of the Bible as though they're in silos. The Israelites were off by themselves in this little bubble here until, the Moabites invaded. Okay, God saved them. Now they're back in their bubble again. And, now the Assyrians invaded. Okay, now they're back in their bubble again. But the fact is that some of the strange people groups who we think only exist in the Bible are actually known to scholars. For example, the Perizzites, who are mentioned in the book of Genesis. Because Jacob is, for example, after the rape of his daughter Dinah, and his sons Simeon and Levi lead their retainers to slaughter all the men of the city of Shechem. He says, "You made me a stink in the nostrils of the Canaanites and the Perizzites." Well, who are the Perizzites? Well, we don't have any other written record mentioning the Perizzites anywhere outside the Bible, so they must be an invention. They were a fiction invented by Moses to demonize the Canaanites and justify taking the land away. Well, no, when you dig into the linguistics of the land, of Ugaritic, of Canaanite, of Hebrew, of Egyptian, and look back and forth at how those words were traded back and forth, Perizzites were actually the Philistines. Okay, so it's not really that mysterious. It's just that we look at the word, assume that it's always been that way, and maybe the spellings changed, maybe the pronunciations changed over the years. There was a group of people mentioned in Genesis and Exodus called the Hivites, Hivite, the Hivites. Who are they? Mm-hmm. Well, according to scholars, Hivite is a Hebrewized version of a name from Luvian, which is an Anatolian language. That's modern-day Turkey. An Anatolian language, Luvian, for Ahiyawa. The Ahiyawa were the Mycenaean Greeks. So there were Greeks in the Holy Land as far back as the time of Abraham. Joshua did battle with the Hivites who lived under Mount Hermon in 15th century BC. So there were Greeks in the land. It's not inconceivable that you would get loan words back and forth between Greek and Hebrew. In fact, the root word behind Anakim, contrary to what some believe, that it refers to long-necked, Scholars have looked at it and said, it's really a stretch. But there is a word in Greek, annex. Yeah, sorry, I didn't even realize I did that there. There is a word in Greek, annex, that means hereditary ruler or high king. So the Anakim were hereditary rulers of Greek extraction who ruled the hill country of Israel and Judah in the time of Joshua. And they had to be wiped out. And when he did, they fled to the Philistine cities, which makes sense because the Philistines also came from the Aegean, the Greek cultures of Greece and Cyprus and Crete. So it makes sense. Hermon, the wilderness being the ancient land of Bashan, it makes all the sense in the world. Jesus went there for his testing and then was carried away to Mount Hermon. He was not in the desert down near Jericho.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, it makes a lot of sense too. The other thing too is the way that it reads, like you kind of had mentioned to it, a very high mountain. Again, there's nothing anywhere near the height, like you said. It's the only mountain range in the entire area that's high enough to get a snow cap 24/7 all year. They have a ski resort up there now, which is crazy. Mount Hermon is now a ski resort. It's kind of terrifying. But the other thing too is,
well, the Israelis also have a spy facility up there, a surveillance base for looking into Syria.
Get out of here, really?
Yeah. And of course, the UN, the UN's got a base up there.
The highest base in the world, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the UN, yeah. Well, you have a lot of things up there, right? And you can go still see this stuff today, right? The remnants of a lot of these things are there. They've excavated.
Yeah.
I've seen photos, right? You can still go to see, the Temple of Pan. There's elements of that left. Pan's Grotto is obviously still there because it's a physical, place that you can still go see. And then, you've also got Nimrod's fortress is fairly close to there. Mm-hmm. The other thing too that's really interesting, and for anybody listening to this show, okay, you may be just like me and you have never been over there, but you know what you do have? You have a computer more than likely and you've got Google Earth. Literally pull up Google Earth or Google Maps and just go look at the area because it will show you the geography of what we're talking about. And it will help make so much more sense of what we're saying because geography really is important to understand all of these things. Because if you go up to Mount Hermon, which is the furthest north that you can get in the country, right? And you look down, it would be the perfect place to take someone to show them all of the land that would potentially be theirs, right? It just makes the most sense.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
You said that the gates of hell or the cave, it was like really deep. Have they ever been to the bottom of it or no?
Well, since 2,000 years ago, since the time of Josephus, they've had a number of pretty powerful earthquakes. The Jordan Rift Valley, or the what they call the Dead Sea Transform, runs from the Red Sea right up through, the Jordan River is right on the fault line. So the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, that's why they're there, is because you got this fault line, you got these two plates that are moving in the same direction but at different rates of speed. And so they've had some pretty massive earthquakes there. They're overdue for a really bad earthquake there. The one that was mentioned in the book of, New Madrid Fault, right?
Yeah.
The one mentioned in the Bible of happening in the time of King Uzziah, they estimate was probably a magnitude 8.2, and they found evidence of it at some of the sites in the region. That was in the 8th century BC. And 250 years later, the prophet Zechariah was still mentioning it. You will flee as they fled in the days of King Uzziah. So the source of the Jordan used to be, at least in part, from that cave. The water would come up from underneath the mountain through the cave, and it would come down. It would join with another stream called the Ion Stream, which we visited, by the way, last March, because that is where, according to First Enoch, the prophet encountered the weeping angels, the watchers who were weeping. So we went to the waterfall there at the Ion Stream, which is where, according to scholars, this is the what in First Enoch it's called. Looks like Abel, Abel, Main, Main. Yeah. It's actually in Hebrew it's Avel Maim, which means waters of weeping. And it's where this stream coming down from Lebanon comes down a waterfall to go down into that valley and joins up with the waters coming out from Dan and from underneath Mount Hermon and forms the Jordan River. But since then, anyway, I'm taking a short story, making it long. The cave has dried up. I mean, it's blocked up. So you can go up there if you could hop the fence, you could go into the cave and walk around in the bottom of the cave. So it is no longer the entrance to the netherworld, sadly. But at least in the time of Josephus 2,000 years ago, nobody had been able to hit bottom with it. So what's underneath there now, nobody knows. It would be interesting to see somebody do some ground penetrating radar to try to map out what opening is below that mountain.
Man. Yeah, does it have like any kind of creepy feeling or anything like that there?
Some of the people who were with us on the tour said they did feel that. I didn't, but maybe I'm just not as sensitive to it. There were a couple of ladies who were there. One of them is a pastor, and her friend. They both said that they felt a sense of heaviness there. They also felt it at Gilgal Rephaim. And they also felt it again when we went over to Jordan. When we were there last year, 2023 was really the first spring since travel had opened up again after the COVID lockdowns. So there was a real backlog of tourism flooding into Israel and flooding into Jordan. We could not spend 2 nights at Petra, sadly. So, and when we were at Petra, we had to split the group into 2 separate hotels. So our second night, we had to go up to Amman, Jordan. And I'm glad we did, because we've been to Petra 3 times now. And I would love to spend just a full day there. I'd like to go there at night and see it at night. But in Amman, we got to go to the citadel. Now, Amman was the capital city of the Ammonite kingdom, and their chief deity was Milcom. And according to 1 Kings, we know that Milcom is Molech. And in my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, I showed how Milcom/Molech was also the entity called El by the Canaanites, who was Kronos, Saturn, Dagon, Shechem, the leader of the rebellion in Genesis chapter 6, and I think Apollyon/Abaddon, who comes out of the bottomless pit in Revelation 9. So there we were on the citadel, the sacred site for the kingdom of Ammon, and there is the remains of a Roman temple there, which scholars believe was a temple of Hercules because of the size. The columns are the largest columns of any temple found anywhere in the Roman world. They're like 40 feet high. Now, why would they make these massive columns there for a temple in Amman, Jordan, which at the time was called Philadelphia, by the way, not have it at, like, yeah, what's really bizarre is that the Philadelphia in Jordan is safer than Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
It's sad to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. A group of our from our tour went out that evening and went to some cafes and went to shop, and they said it's safe and it's great, and the police are everywhere, and it's safe, it's clean, which you can't say about Philadelphia, especially that Kensington area where you've got the people all on that trank. It's anyway. That temple, they've only found a few fragments of the idol, the statue of the deity worshipped there. And again, they think it's Hercules because of the size. There's a giant elbow and a giant, hand that's all that's left of the statue. And again, it's because of the massive earthquakes that have taken place in the 2,000 years since that temple was built. But the temple below it, they believe, was the Ammonite temple to Milcom, who the Hebrews called Molech. So my thinking is if the Romans did what they did in other locations, for example, at Baalbek, they covered up the temple of Baal with the temple to Jupiter, because Jupiter, the storm god, was just Baal, the storm god. The Greeks called him Zeus, and the Hittites called him Tarhunta. Is the same deity, just different name, different language. So I think, and I've not found any scholars to back me up on this, but I think it was the temple of Saturn. Anyway, we're there visiting their archaeological museum and this little site there, and we got this temple to Milcom below the temple of Saturn, Hercules, whatever. And again, these 2 ladies they were like, had this sense of dread, this real feeling of ugliness. I didn't feel it, but they said they did, and I have no reason to doubt them. They're intelligent, well-spoken, productive people. So, and we had one incident in our previous tour in 2019 of a young man, a teenager, who had just graduated from high school, and his father had taken him to Israel. This was his graduation gift. I mean, humbling. His father, graduation gift, I'm going to take you to Israel with these two weird people from the Ozarks. This young man, his father told us later, we didn't know this going in, but he told us later that his son is a seer. He can see into the spirit realm. And so on our way to Joshua's altar, we stop at an overlook where you can look down into the city of Nablus, because the ancient city of Shechem is there. You can see the well of Jacob down there, or at least the location of it. You can see the tomb of Joseph from up there. And so, the tour guides will stop us there on our way to Joshua's altar and tell us a bit about the city and all this. Well, the young man started feeling ill, and he had to return to the bus. It's like, okay, well, go up there. And the IDF soldier who's guarding the bus up there, because we had to have an IDF escort to go there, again, the bulletproof buses, we'll keep an eye on him. And later we found out that this young man, and he didn't know this because he left before I was able to share this, what I shared with you earlier, that city, Shechem, Nablus today, was sacred to the plague god Resheph, also known as Apollo. What he said he saw later that made him physically ill was a giant entity appear, manifest in the air over the city, looking at us, clearly malevolent, and appeared to be on fire, burning, flaming. Now, the plague deity was believed to spread disease, Apollo, Nergal, Resheph, with his bow, Greek word toxon, the word translated bow in Revelation chapter 6 for the rider on the white horse. And he didn't know this. He didn't know that I was about to tell the group about Resheph, Apollo, and the fact that this was a city sacred to that deity, and that deity was the patron deity of the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and that God had directed Moses and the Israelites to go there directly after crossing over the Jordan and conquering Jericho, to set up an altar there and the blessings and curses, to seal the covenant with Yahweh there at that city. And there we were, this group of Christians looking down on it. This young man sees this giant, burning, malevolent entity over the city, and he was physically ill. So,
wow.
And again, we had no idea before we got there, because his father shared this with us later after he got back and checked on his son. His son is fine. Why did you? And his son shared this with him, and then his dad shared that with us later. And again, we had no reason to think, okay, the kid looked like, I don't know, he looked like a high school athlete. He was not a person you would look at and say that looks like somebody who's like not quite. No, he looked like a handsome young man, and his dad, again, normal people who are seeing these supernatural things. And bringing it into the context of the modern church today, how would you as a Christian parent, in fact, we've got a friend of ours, Doug Overmeyer, who has a ministry called Seers See Ministries, because they've got a daughter who likewise sees into the spirit realm. How do you as a Christian parent deal with a child who can see those things? Most pastors don't know what to do with it. Well, it's demonic.
Exactly.
Well,
that's immediately the first place the church goes to. It's immediate.
Right.
It's so funny to me because it's like we see all of these things in the Bible. We've got books dedicated to people who have these types of visions. Why did we think magically it stopped? Why would God just stop giving gifts out to people?
Yeah. And I think coming back to your question earlier, why did we lose this view? A lot of blame is placed on Augustine, the brilliant church theologian of the 5th century, who really popularized the idea, first proposed by a fellow named Julius Africanus about 100 years before. So in the 4th century, the early 300s, Julius Africanus wrote that the sons of God in Genesis chapter 6 were really the sons of Seth, and they, there was nothing supernatural about the giants or the Nephilim. They were just evil children because the sons of Seth intermingled with the daughters of Cain. Again, from a logical standpoint, that makes no sense. Why would they produce evil kids? Why is it only the evil daughters of Cain? Were there no sons of Cain marrying into the daughters of Japheth? Or, and where was Japheth in all of this?
Why would they be larger in stature? It's clearly stated that they're larger in stature.
Yeah. So they were trying to de-supernaturalize it then. And I think Augustine, because he was coming out of a cult, Manichaeism, that had a little too much attention paid to angels and not to, the Trinity, was trying to de-emphasize the spirit realm so that people wouldn't be tempted into venerating the angelic realm. And ironically, sadly, it was Augustine who sort of Christianized the veneration of the Rephaim, or the veneration of the heroes, the demigods, which was common, or the deceased ancestors. The practice of holding ritual meals for deceased ancestors and summoning them to what was essentially a necromantic ritual meal never ended. When Constantine legalized the faith in the 4th century, the earliest Christian churches, including St. Peter's Basilica, were built on the grounds of cemeteries. Because even 300 years into the faith, the Christian church, the bishops, the pastors of the churches in these cities had not gotten Christians to stop summoning the spirits of their ancestors to have ritual meals. And so, we'll build a church right here at the cemetery, and that way grandma doesn't have to travel very far to come and have the meal with us. So Augustine basically said, and this is based on scholarly peer-reviewed research, Augustine essentially said, well, the spirits of the saints, the holy men and women of years gone by, can also intercede for us in the spirit. Okay, we can't beat them, so let's just join them. Let's try to redirect it. Wow. And this is how the practice of the veneration of saints entered into the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. They couldn't get. It was so ingrained in the culture that Christians wouldn't and couldn't, for whatever reason, just refuse to stop doing it. It continues to this day. In fact, Roman Catholics, South Korean Roman Catholics, were given a special dispensation by the church. Okay, you can keep your shrines to your ancestors. Look, we don't do this anymore. But
right.
What? I mean, they even found, when they were doing reconstructive work at the Vatican, at St. Peter's Basilica, and they found the sarcophagus believed to hold the remains of Peter. Don't know whether it does or not, but they think it does. The one right next to his, which presumably was an early Christian, has a libation tube in it, so you can pour a drink in there so that the corpse of whoever's in there can drink in the afterlife.
Wow.
This is directly from the Amorite ritual called the Kispum, where every month you would summon the deceased ancestors by name, that's necromancy, and offer them the teraphim, the household idols that Jacob stole from his father-in-law. That's what they were used for. They'd have them these little chairs at the table. You'd take a little piece of bread, you'd smear it on the face of okay, now we're feeding Grandpa, now we're feeding Grandma, now we're feeding Uncle Hermon. And then we pour out a drink offering so that they will have food and drink in the afterlife. This is how we sustain them in the afterlife. And this practice has continued to this day. All of us know of like a nail shop or something where you've got a little shrine to the ancestors and you put a little offering of, a candy bar or a cigarette or a shot of vodka or whatever to appease the deceased ancestors. This goes all the way back to the Amorites, the first known people group in writing. Now, this probably extended way into prehistory, but at least in terms of what we can document through written records, the Amorites are the first known people group to perform this ritual in Mesopotamia, dating to about the 24th century BC. Given that the name of the Greek gods, the Titans, who were the ones banished to Tartarus, just like the sinful angels of 2 Peter 2, verse 4. They were thrust down to Tartarus, not hell. The word in Greek is Tartarosis. That word derives from the name of an ancient Amorite tribe, the Tadanu. So I think there's a link there between this practice of trying to reek with spirits on the other side of the veil, and perhaps even in the netherworld, goes back to the Amorites and the people who come from northern Mesopotamia, the Hurrians. And, that's, again, that a lot of that is in my book, The Second Coming of Saturn, but we also kind of recapitulate that in the forthcoming Gates of Hell. How are we trying to open those gates? Not we personally, not us as Christians, but how are we as humans trying to reopen those gates of hell? Where do we find them? Well, in Scripture, we can show that there are some places that were considered to be portals to the netherworld, like Mount Hermon, like the Grotto of Pan, like Bashan. But we would suggest that in the modern world, these gates are wherever we are, because it's whatever we allow into us, into our hearts. That's what creates the portal between us and that unseen realm.
Yeah, no, it's great because go ahead, Ben. You got a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, all the cultures that do that with the keeping the dead bodies around, it seems like they have a lot of natural disasters close to them, or things happen, or, bad things. I don't know do you think that could be part of God's judgment to them?
Well, it could be, but I think we can also, argue that there are a lot of bad things that happen here in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And there are those who made the connection between disasters here in the United States and how we've treated Israel since 1948. I don't know. I think Billy Graham once said, if God does not smite the United States, he owes Sodom and Gomorrah an apology. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But we argue in the book, The Gates of Hell, we write about Sodom and why it was destroyed. The site has been located by a team from Trinity Southwest University, and they show that the evidence of the destruction at this location, northeast of the Dead Sea, about 8 miles northeast of the Dead Sea, was absolutely astonishing. But that also happens to be the location of the tightest concentration of dolmens in the Jordan River Valley. Well, isn't that coincidental if you're a coincidence theorist? So
right.
It's connected to the cult of the dead. We didn't even mention in the book, because honestly, I didn't know how I could get my head around it and explain it, but I've talked about this in presentations. There's a site very near this location, and the site of Sodom is a tall, or a mound. It's like a hill overlooking the south end of the Jordan River Valley just before it enters the Dead Sea. It's about 8 miles northeast of the Dead Sea. It's called Tal El Hammam. But between there and the Dead Sea is an ancient site called Tel El Gasul, which dates back to 4000 BC or earlier, perhaps. And they found a wall painting, which astonishes me that in that climate, that anything like a wall painting could be preserved. Now, most of it had flaked off the wall, but they used a computer program to reconstruct what this looked like. And it appears to show a religious procession heading into a building. A group of people wearing strange, bizarre masks. The leader much, much taller than the people who are following him. The leader carrying a flail, which is a symbol of power in the ancient world. The people following him are nude except for these weird masks. They appear to be dancing. And what's really interesting, and again, 6,000 years after the painter painted this on the wall of this building, we have no way of knowing if he was just a bad artist or if he was making a point. As you look carefully at the hand around the flail, you'll notice it has 6 fingers. Bigger than everybody else, much bigger, and with 6 fingers. So, and this is this. Yeah. And this is the culture that eventually moved up onto that hill and founded the city of Sodom, which was continuously occupied for about 2,500 years until it was destroyed around the time of Abraham, circa 1800, 1700 BC. So what was worshipped there? As the director of scientific analysis for the dig, Dr. Philip Sylvia, told me in an interview that people can find on my podcast if they care, the dolmens at the base of the city, the base of Sodom, 1,500 dolmens. I asked him if they were arranged according to astronomy. Did they face the winter solstice or the equinox or something? He said, no, they all appear to face the sacred precinct on top of the Tal. It's like, oh, well, who is worshipped there? He said, we don't know because we haven't found the records at the site. As of last year's dig, which may have been the last season they're ever going to dig there, they still had not found any texts there, but still, that was in the vicinity of where the Israelites worshipped the Baal of Peor, and Peor coming from a Hebrew word meaning opening or cleft or gap. And in the context of what happened there, based on Psalm 106, verse 28, where the Hebrews the Israelites were punished by God because they were eating sacrifices offered to the dead. It's possible that Baal Peor, which means Lord of something, probably means Lord of the gates of hell. And again, we go into that in detail in the forthcoming book.
Yeah, no, wow, it's just crazy. It's amazing to me how here we are, 2024, and all these things are more relevant almost today than they ever have been before. And that's one of the things I kind of wanted to finish with today, Derek, to ask you. You know, we just had this eclipse, and I know a whole bunch of crazy things were said about the eclipse, but do you think that there was any message in the eclipse for us? You know, I just, what's echoing in my mind right now is the quote from Billy Graham, which I'd never heard before, but boy, oh boy, does that feel more accurate today than ever. Do you think that there was a message in there for us?
I heard that too, and I know that there are even friends of ours who were looking at the path and saying, oh, it crosses a number of cities or regions or counties or whatever with the name Nineveh. So this is America's Nineveh moment. I would respectfully suggest that Nineveh was spared God's judgment because the king repented first and then ordered all of his people to repent. So I don't think we're going to see that kind of an order coming out of this White House.
No, I don't.
I do think, though, that the message for us as Christians is that, look, we have been able to predict the specific date and path of this eclipse for literally hundreds of years. God created this universe and set it in motion with such precision. And that precision is not just to show that he is the designer, but also the precision required to support life on this planet, and specifically human life on this planet. So rather than looking at this and saying, oh, it's a warning, what can it mean? It's an aleph, it's a tav, I just take it as more evidence that we're living in a place and at a time that God chose for us since the beginning of time. And we should take comfort in that and rejoice in it, because he's placed us on the battlefield, on the chessboard, whatever metaphor you want to use, at this particular point in history for his reasons, because he knows his will be done, and we have a role to play in that. No matter how small a role, no role is unimportant. That, I think, is the takeaway for us. Find our mission in his army, and then go out and seize the day. Because while these things happening around us are dark and disturbing, when Jesus said, when you see all these things, look up, because your redemption is getting close.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that's very, very well said. So kind of shifting gears overseas now, and we kind of had talked about this before we started recording, but I wanted to have a little bit deeper discussion on it to get your take on it. You know, we've got this sacrifice that, in my opinion, I know Ben and I talked about this, and we share opinion on this, is, you know, they're gonna do this sacrifice at some point. You know, whenever that time comes, when everything is, you know, lined up properly. I know there was a lot of discussion about doing it, you know, a couple of days before Passover and then at Passover. And there's a tremendous amount of heat over there. And you would kind of mention that, you know, maybe the cows aren't even old enough yet to do this. But it sure seems like it's going to happen at some point, unless God decides it's not going to happen. You know, what's your take on that? And do you think that that is a really true sign that, you know, we are kind of getting near the end here?
Yeah, it is a sign that we're getting near the end. I think Christians who are encouraging it and encouraging the Temple Institute and other pro-Third Temple movements just need to step back and look in Scripture and see where it is we're commanded to build a third temple. We don't need a temple because we've got our high priest is already at the throne of God. But it does tell us what Jews and what others in that part of the world are thinking about the end times. There is a significant portion of the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim in Israel, who believe that the arrival of Messiah is imminent if he's not already here. The same is true among Sunni Muslims. The difference between Sunni and Shia is that Sunni, like Christians, we believe that there is nothing we can, let me take that back. Sunnis, like Jews, believe that if they find the right leader as the Messiah or the Mahdi, they can jumpstart the apocalypse. They can immanentize the eschaton, to use an academic term. Whereas we Christians, like Shia Muslims, believe it's going to happen when it happens. We as Christians believe Christ will return when God wills it, not 1 second sooner. Shia Muslims, the Mahdi will come back when he comes back, when Allah wills it, not 1 second sooner. Kind of odd. They've got the same sort of division, even though sadly Muslims are following the wrong entity. But I think that's the thing, though. If God decides it's not going to happen, it won't happen. If it happens, it's because he allows it to happen. So we as Christians, regardless of what is happening, there is let's say an adrenaline addiction that some people, I think, need to break free from, that we get caught up into social media looking for a daily dose of doom. I've got to get on social media and find out what to freak out about today.
Yeah.
Carl Gallups, our friend Carl Gallups said back in 2020, after the election, regarding the statistical improbabilities, God did not take a look at the results that day, slap himself on the forehead and say, gee, I didn't see that coming. He's seen the end from the beginning. So whatever happens, and we're in the middle of it, it may not be what we would prefer. It may catch us by surprise, but we can take comfort in the fact that it's not catching him by surprise. And our mission, regardless of who's in the White House or whether they're sacrificing red heifers, is the same. It is to make disciples of all nations and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And that baptism, by the way, we were blessed to hear Mike Heiser teach on this at the Jordan River. In 1 Peter 3, where he discusses this, he literally connects baptism and to Jesus descending and proclaiming to the spirits in prison. And that word spirit in that verse, in 1 Peter 3, verse 19, I think it is, never refers to human spirits unless it is specifically qualified as such. He is down there proclaiming not to the dead, he's proclaiming to the watchers who were thrust down to Tartarus in the days of Noah, basically saying, and I'm going to paraphrase Mike Heiser because I give credit where it's due, hey, I bet you didn't expect to see me here, but here's a news flash. At dawn of the third day, I'm getting out, and you're still dead. And Peter connects baptism to this, so that when we baptize people, it is essentially a declaration of victory. So that is what we are called to do. Disciple people, baptize them, declare victory. Hey, we've got another one on the Lord's team, and oh yeah, you're still dead. And we can do that regardless of who is sitting in the Oval Office. So let's focus on that, not get too caught up in the politics of the day. Yeah, they're important because it governs our ability to just live life and get things done. But ultimately, this world will pass away. Let's focus on forever.
That's great, man. Amen. Well said, my friend. Well said. Well, I won't hold you up anymore. We won't hold you up anymore. But do you have any final thoughts? Anybody? Where can somebody go and actually? Are you pre-orders for your book even up yet, or is it so early on that they can't even do that?
It is very early. It again, the book has not even been sent to the typesetter just yet. A lot of what we talked about is in our previous works, though: Giants, Gods, and Dragons, Veneration, the Second Coming of Saturn. People can follow us at gilberthouse.org, gilberthouse.org. We got a weekly Bible study called the Gilbert House Fellowship, where we talk about a lot of these things, a weekly broadcast show, Unraveling Revelation, a couple of other podcasts. In fact, there's so much content, we've got an app. Just get our app, and you can get it for free, iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire, and all of our content goes right there. That's just in case they decide to try to cancel us again. And we'll
yes,
try to get out ahead of that. Yeah. So, but that's the place. It's sort of our web hub for everything. gilberthouse.org.
All right. Well, Derek, thanks so much, man. We really appreciate you coming on the show. Appreciate your knowledge, your vast knowledge of the area, sharing that with us, sharing that with our listeners. We really appreciate you taking the time. We know you're a busy man, so thank you very much.
My honor. Thank you very much.
You guys have a safe trip, too.
Thank you.